He never imagined that his last weapon would be a rope-cutting knife tucked into his vest as a joke days earlier. The building they were in had already started to fall apart. Walls cracked, ceilings hanging loose. There were only 3 of them left, cut off, surrounded, and nearly out of strength. The radio was dead. No response. No orders, no reinforcements. Just silence on the other end of the line. Outside the door they could hear footsteps. Voices in a language they couldn't fully understand whispered commands and signaled the approach of death. They had fired their last rounds hours ago. One of the men had bled out in a corner. The other 2 were crouched in shadows, hearts pounding, hands gripping nothing but empty weapons and dull metal. He remembered what his teammate had said before taking a bullet to the chest. "If we run out, don't go down without something in your hand." It was half a laugh when he said it. Now it echoed like a prophecy. When the enemy came crashing through that door, he didn't run, didn't beg, didn't freeze. He moved forward, blade in hand, driven by instinct, not courage. He chose not to die on his knees, even if that meant meeting death at arm's length. What happened in those next 60 seconds changed everything. Not just for him, but for everyone who would later ask how they survived Fallujah. Fallujah, Iraq, 2004. The city lay under a haze of smoke and tension, buildings jagged and broken from days of fighting. The air smelled of heat, dust, and oil. The sun had not yet risen high, casting long shadows across the rubble-filled streets. A 10-man Marine reconnaissance team moved cautiously through the eastern district. Their objective was to clear a series of abandoned structures and mark safe zones for the next wave of advancing troops. Intelligence suggested that the area had already been swept clean, with little expected resistance. Still, the atmosphere carried a weight that made every step deliberate. The team operated with practiced efficiency. Boots crunched softly on broken glass and gravel. Their rifles moved in unison, scanning every doorway, every window. The streets were eerily quiet. No signs of civilians, no vehicles, just silence and debris. The buildings they passed bore the scars of intense urban combat. Bullet-riddled walls, scorched interiors, and collapsed ceilings. Inside one of the homes, a charred mattress sat in the middle of the floor like a forgotten relic. Dust particles danced in the shafts of sunlight piercing through broken roofs. Despite the stillness, unease settled over them like a second skin. Radios crackled occasionally, but connections were weak. The signal was inconsistent, fading in and out without warning. One of the Marines glanced at his comms, trying to recalibrate the frequency, but the interference continued. It was written off as local disruption, a common issue in densely built combat zones. The squad pressed on. They advanced in formation, checking corners and entry points with precision. There was no talking. Only the occasional hand signals and the low hum of controlled breathing under tactical helmets. One Marine, a corporal, lingered momentarily at a wall covered in graffiti. Most of it was in Arabic, some of it newer than the rest. He stared for a second too long before moving on. The third structure on their route was a 3-story apartment building with a crumbling facade. Sandbags were piled at the base, but they were old, torn, and caked with dust. No fresh footprints, no signs of movement. The unit approached carefully. 2 Marines took position at the entry, checking the stairwell while the others secured the perimeter. Inside, the building was cooler, the concrete shielding it from the desert sun. The halls were narrow, lined with doors that hung off their hinges. Broken glass and scattered debris covered the floor. They moved room by room, clearing with silent precision. The walls bore soot stains, and bullet holes marked violent exchanges that had already passed. On the second floor, they found signs of recent habitation. Empty ration packs, a tattered blanket, and a rusted AK magazine. No bodies, no fresh blood. Nothing definitive, but enough to suggest someone had been there recently. Upstairs, the 3rd floor offered a vantage point over the street. From there, they could see several blocks in each direction. The scope of destruction was staggering. Rubble filled the alleys, overturned cars lined the roads, and here and there blackened skeletons of buildings stood as grim reminders of prior offensives. The silence remained unnerving, too quiet, too still. A breeze pushed dust through the open windows. It made the place feel hollow and watchful. They regrouped on the 2nd floor to confirm their findings. The commanding officer reviewed the notes on a worn-out map, marking their progress and the clear zones. The plan was to finish sweeping 2 more buildings before rendezvous with the support convoy scheduled for extraction in the afternoon. Time was on their side, at least for now. Downstairs, another Marine monitored the blocked road ahead through binoculars. He noted no movement, no heat signatures, and no visible threats. The team had been in country long enough to know that this often meant trouble. The calm before the storm. Veterans referred to it as the dead space, a moment where everything felt untouched, as if time itself held its breath. Sweat gathered under their armor, and fatigue pressed against their backs, but they kept moving. War didn't care for comfort or certainty. It lived in the unknown, and in that moment, the unknown stretched out in every direction. The team moved toward the next building. The lead man glanced up, catching the glint of glass in a distant window. He paused, squinting, trying to determine if it was a trick of the light or something more. The team paused at the threshold of the next building, stacking against the wall. The point man raised a closed fist. All movement stopped. The sound of the wind slipping through the alley filled the void. The moment hung there, stretched thin by instinct and experience. Then the fist lowered. They advanced. Inside, the building was darker than the others. The smell of mildew mixed with old smoke. The walls were damp in places. An overturned cabinet blocked part of the hallway, and the remains of furniture had been used to build makeshift barricades. A Marine knelt and examined the floor. More footprints. Not fresh, but not old either. The team split, half moving to clear the first floor while the others secured the stairwell. The building groaned under its own weight. Somewhere above them, something fell, a soft thud echoing through the interior. Weapons came up. Hearts raced. But there was nothing. No movement, no voice, no gunfire. Just the building shifting under strain. The floor above seemed unstable. The team lead ordered caution. They continued, more alert than before. Tension thickened with every step. The building felt wrong. Heavy, as if it held something back just out of sight. The air inside was warmer, despite the shade. The kind of warmth that came not from heat, but from breath. One Marine stopped at a door. It was half open, revealing a room filled with debris. A child's toy sat in the corner, untouched by the chaos. The Marine stared at it for a second before continuing. These moments, fleeting as they were, had weight. They reminded them that this was once someone's home. Now, it was just another piece of the battlefield. As they finished the final sweep of the structure, the signal in their radios faltered again. A low hiss, a broken voice, and then silence. They waited for it to come back. It didn't. The building stood quiet, holding its breath. The world outside had not changed, but something in the air had. They prepared to move to the next sector. The sun was now higher, casting brighter light but offering no clarity. The mission continued, but something had shifted. An unseen line had been crossed, and though they didn't know it yet, the day was about to take a violent, irreversible turn. They stepped into the narrow alley that separated the fourth building from the rest of the block. The layout was tighter here. Debris was thicker, the shadows longer, and the space between walls felt more compressed. It was the kind of passage where sound became confusing, where echoes misled and movement disappeared quickly into broken lines of sight. The Marines moved cautiously, eyes scanning up as much as forward. The buildings on either side rose like hollowed-out skeletons, windows empty, balconies sagging with age and impact. Halfway through the alley, something shifted in the air. A faint hum. A static electricity that clung to the skin. Then, without warning, the crack of a high-powered rifle sliced through the quiet. A single shot echoed, precise and sharp. It struck the lead Marine in the upper chest, sending him backward into the dirt. His body armor absorbed most of the impact, but the force knocked the wind out of him. The team scattered, instinct driving them to cover. The air erupted with shouts, weapons raised, eyes searching for a source that wasn't visible. Seconds later, a second shot rang out. This time it struck one of the rear Marines in the thigh. He went down hard, screaming through clenched teeth as blood pooled beneath him. The others moved into defensive positions, spreading out along walls and behind debris piles. The alley became a trap, a long, narrow corridor with minimal exit and even less protection. It was a textbook kill zone, and they were caught inside it. The Marines began scanning rooftops and windows with their scopes, searching for the glint of glass, the silhouette of a muzzle, anything. But the shooter was well hidden, using the density of the ruins to his advantage. There was no pattern to the timing of the shots. He was patient, calculating, waiting for movement. The team's training took over. They coordinated silently, communicating through hand signals, shifting positions in pairs, laying down suppression in brief bursts to cover movement. Another shot hit the wall near one Marine's helmet, fragments of concrete biting into his cheek. He stayed low, blood trickling down his jawline. The shooter's aim was good, too good. He wasn't just firing into the alley, he was targeting with purpose, waiting for windows of opportunity no longer than a second. The squad split into two elements. One group pushed toward a nearby entrance, hoping to flank through the building. The other held position, providing cover fire even without a clear target. The rifleman was somewhere above, maybe behind a broken balcony or in the hollow of a stairwell. One Marine deployed a smoke grenade. The cloud spilled across the alley, providing some concealment. The sound of glass shattering followed, the shooter adjusting position, maybe retreating, maybe preparing a new angle. Inside the building, the flanking team advanced up a ruined stairwell. The interior was tight, lined with trash and sagging doorframes. They moved fast but careful, every creak of the floor beneath their boots a risk. On the second floor, they found an old firing position, spent casings, a cloth laid out for a rifle, food wrappers, and an empty water bottle. But the shooter had moved on. He was mobile and smart, using temporary hides instead of static nests. Below, the pinned team attempted to extract the wounded Marine. Under cover of smoke, two dragged him to the base of a wall, applying a tourniquet and bandages as best they could. His breathing was heavy but stable. He gripped the dirt beside him, trying to stay conscious. He had lost a lot of blood, but he wasn't out of the fight yet. The medic worked quickly, glancing up every few seconds, knowing that one more shot could change everything. A third rifle report cracked through the alley. It missed, but just barely. It hit a piece of rebar jutting from the wall, sending a ringing metallic whine through the space. The shooter was closer now, adjusting his angle. The Marines didn't have visual, but they could feel the direction change. He had repositioned, and he was zeroing in again. The flanking team reached the roof. From there, they had partial visibility across the block. Smoke still drifted through the lower alley, but it was thinning fast. A sudden movement caught one of their eyes. Just the flicker of a shadow disappearing into another rooftop door. The squad leader marked the position, but they couldn't pursue immediately. The exposure was too great. The rooftops were flat but open, and there was no cover between them. Any advance would turn them into easy targets. Instead, they radioed the rest of the team, coordinating a pincer movement. They would suppress from above while the alley team pushed into the adjacent building. Even without full comms clarity, the intent was understood. The two groups acted simultaneously. One team laid down suppressive fire in the general direction of the suspected nest, bursts that cracked and echoed against the stone. The other moved under the cover of that fire, carrying their wounded comrade into the building's dark interior. Inside, it was chaos in slow motion. Dust floated in the beams of light. The stairwell groaned under the weight of boots. Their breaths came fast, short, controlled. The wounded Marine was laid down against the base of the wall, monitored closely while the rest of the team fanned out through the structure. The building gave no resistance, but the feeling of threat lingered in every corner. The sniper hadn't disappeared, he had relocated, and his presence infected the building like a scent. Another shot rang out. This time it came from a different direction, sharper, closer. It punched through the window frame of the second floor, spraying wood and glass across the hallway. The team hit the ground, rolling into rooms for cover. They were inside, but they weren't safe. The enemy was repositioning faster than expected. He knew the terrain better. He was controlling the tempo. Outside, the other team on the roof adjusted their overwatch angle. One Marine spotted a figure for just a second. A quick glimpse of cloth, the shoulder of a rifle, then nothing. He fired. A single shot. No confirmation of hit. No cry. Just silence. Then for a long minute, nothing. No fire. No movement. The alley below lay still again, the smoke now gone, revealing the full stretch of debris and spent casings. The Marines regrouped inside the building, checking each other for wounds, reloading what they had used. One man counted only 3 magazines left, another had 2. The realization crept in slowly. They were burning through ammunition fast, and the fight had barely begun. One of the Marines checked their injured teammate again. His pulse was slowing. He needed evacuation. But the call for medevac was met with static. They were cut off. The sniper had not only wounded them physically, but had disrupted their movement, forced them into defensive positions, and burned valuable time. The squad lead assessed the next move. They could not stay in the building. It was compromised. But leaving meant crossing exposed ground again, possibly within line of sight. The team prepared to move, knowing the next moments would be critical. The enemy was out there, waiting, patient, and still armed. Their world had changed in the span of minutes. From a routine clearance mission, They had entered a deadly game of hide and hunt, where the margin of survival thinned with every shot fired. The team repositioned within the building, fanning out across the interior in staggered pairs. The sniper's last shot had confirmed one thing: they were being watched from multiple angles. The line between offense and survival blurred quickly. They secured the structure as best they could, clearing each floor room by room, but the tension inside thickened with each step. Shadows moved in their peripheral vision, but when they turned, nothing was there. The building felt like a maze, each hallway a dead end, every door a potential ambush point. Outside, the streets had changed. New sounds echoed from blocks away. Faint movement, boots scraping against stone, the clatter of shifting debris, short bursts of Arabic commands. It was no longer a distant battle. The enemy was repositioning, reorganizing, and surrounding them. It didn't take long for them to realize the building they now occupied had become the center of a tightening noose. The rooftop team remained in place, attempting to maintain overwatch, but visibility was increasingly limited. The sun had shifted, casting sharp shadows over potential entry points. The surrounding buildings created blind spots, and even with scopes, the Marines couldn't track all threats at once. The rooftop provided height, but no safety. Every exposed position risked drawing fire, and the sniper had already proven his accuracy. The squad below moved to reinforce the perimeter. Barricades were hastily constructed using broken furniture, overturned desks, anything that could absorb a round or delay an advance. One Marine laid tripwire flares along a hallway, while another braced a collapsed door with metal piping. The sound of tools echoed against concrete, sharp and frantic, every clang carrying weight. Their world had become smaller. Every meter mattered now. Communications remained unreliable. The radio hissed and clicked, but offered no voice, no reassurance that backup was on the way. They sent short bursts of status reports anyway, hoping something would get through. No response came. The longer the silence stretched, the more isolated they felt. The team lead checked his watch, marking time since initial contact. Nearly 40 minutes had passed. Every second bled energy and ammunition. Movement began again at the edges of their hearing, this time closer. Shuffling, rapid footsteps, short commands muffled by walls. Then came the first test. A burst of automatic fire struck the southern wall, riddling it with holes and sending dust spraying into the room. No one was hit, but the message was clear. They were being pinned. Moments later, the north side echoed with return fire. Another group. Another position. The encirclement had begun. From the rooftop, a Marine called out positions, identifying figures darting between buildings. Too fast to target, too scattered to suppress. They were probing, testing the perimeter. A few rounds were exchanged, but the enemy stayed elusive. The rooftop fire was meant to deter, not eliminate. Ammunition was already running low. Inside, the building shook with the thuds of grenades going off outside. Not close enough to breach the structure, but close enough to send vibrations through the walls and floors. Plaster cracked. Small fragments of ceiling dropped to the floor. The Marines braced themselves behind makeshift cover, eyes locked on doorways and stairwells. They were preparing for an assault. The next hour unfolded in bursts. Skirmishes flared along the perimeter. Quick exchanges of fire, short-lived advances that were repelled only through disciplined coordination and carefully measured rounds. They couldn't afford to shoot without purpose. Every bullet counted. Magazines were swapped with increasing urgency. When someone ran low, others pooled their remaining rounds, redistributing what little they had. 2 men were down to 1 mag each. Another had started removing rounds from an unused grenade launcher pouch and loading them into loose clips. A Marine opened a ration pack and dumped it out to use the packaging as noise buffers for a tripwire trap. He tucked a fragmentation grenade into the end of a hallway and rigged a line to a doorknob, tying it off with cord from his belt. Improvised defense, made with calm hands and exhausted eyes. The atmosphere was one of grim determination. No one panicked. They just moved. Precise, automatic, practiced. Outside, the sound of engines rumbled for a brief moment, and then faded. No aircraft, no armor. Possibly a technical moving into position, or another attempt at psychological pressure. The insurgents didn't need to storm the building, they just needed to wait. Exhaustion would do the rest. Inside, water was low. No one had slept. Time was becoming as much an enemy as the fighters outside. The injured Marine remained unconscious, though his bleeding had stabilized. A field dressing soaked through, changed once already. He was placed in the quietest corner, away from the direct line of fire, monitored every few minutes by whoever had a free second between defensive duties. He hadn't moved in over 30 minutes. His skin was cold. The others said nothing. As night approached, the light inside the building grew dim, forcing them to rely on flashlights used sparingly. Any glow risked exposure. But without them, visibility inside narrowed to just a few feet. They used the last hour of daylight to strengthen choke points, reinforce barricades, and recheck all entry zones. The building had become a fortress, not by design, but necessity. Then came the whispering. Outside the walls, faint voices echoed in a language they didn't fully understand. The cadence was quick, rehearsed. Calls and responses between small units positioning for something larger. No shots were fired, but the sound was worse than gunfire. It was coordination, planning, an invisible thread tightening around them. A single Marine sat near the front stairwell, counting his rounds one by one. 17 in one mag, 15 in the next. One full clip in reserve. That was it. He had begun conserving even more than before, only firing when absolutely certain of a target. Others were down to even less. The team leader performed another quick count. Collectively, they had fewer than 3 full magazines per man. And that estimate didn't include potential jams, dropped rounds, or the stress of combat causing miscounts. From the rooftop, night fell fully. The stars came out, but the city remained dark. No lights, no electricity, just outlines of buildings like jagged teeth under a black sky. Every sound carried further. A cough, a shift of boots, the rattle of a sling against armor, all dangerous now. Suddenly, a flash from the south. Not gunfire, but a flare, short, white, arcing into the sky. A signal. It illuminated the area for just a second, casting long shadows through the broken cityscape. In that second, Marines saw silhouettes moving at a distance. Dozens, maybe more. A coordinated push. Not random fighters. A planned maneuver. They had drawn in the team, surrounded the building, and now the pieces were falling into place. Inside, there was no room for doubt. They checked their weapons again, reinforced the final barricades, and prepared for a siege. There would be no reinforcement, not yet. No ammo resupply. No extraction. Just survival. And whatever they could do with what little remained. The walls creaked. Dust fell from the ceiling. Boots shuffled. Magazines clicked into place. They waited. They listened. And they counted. The moment before it began was the stillest of all. The building held its breath. The dust hung motionless in the air, and the Marines waited behind barricades and broken furniture, their weapons aimed into shadows. No one spoke. Breathing was slow and deliberate, controlled in the way that only combat could train a person to do. Outside, there was silence. Not the kind that meant safety, but the kind that meant precision. The enemy was no longer testing. They were ready. The first breach came at the rear stairwell. A concussive blast shook the structure, sending a cloud of plaster and smoke into the hallway. The door splintered off its hinges, flying inward with enough force to slam against the far wall. A brief pause followed. Then came movement. Fast, purposeful, close. The Marines opened fire immediately, short bursts meant to conserve ammunition while halting the advance. The muzzle flashes lit the narrow passage in flickering bursts, illuminating blurred shapes and flying debris. 2 insurgents dropped in the doorway, their momentum carrying them forward. Others behind them scattered, returning fire from the base of the stairs. One Marine was struck in the shoulder, spinning him into the wall. He groaned, rolled over, and kept firing with one hand. The other pressed against the growing patch of blood under his armor. Another dropped prone and emptied his last full magazine, scattering bullets down the hallway until the weapon clicked dry. He didn't reach for another mag. He knew there wasn't one left. From the other end of the building, another explosion tore through a boarded window. This time, there was no delay. Several fighters poured into the lower level simultaneously, weapons raised. The Marines responded with everything they had. One hurled a fragmentation grenade through the smoke, the detonation sending bodies against the wall and spraying shrapnel across the room. Screams followed, brief, harsh, human. But they were being overrun. The enemy was coming in waves, pressing in from every side, ignoring their own casualties. The numbers were too high, the angles too many. The building no longer offered protection. It had become a killing ground. A Marine in the second-floor hallway pulled his sidearm, knowing his rifle was useless now. He had fired the last of his rounds minutes earlier. His body armor was scorched, the edges of his sleeves blackened by the explosions. His movements slowed, deliberate. He fired with cold accuracy, counting every shot, each one taking another step closer to silence. Downstairs, 2 Marines dragged the unconscious man from earlier into a back room, trying to shield him from the incoming fire. His condition had worsened. His face was pale, his breath shallow. They placed him behind a desk, shielding him with what little remained of their gear. One of them gave up his last water bottle, pouring a few drops onto the wounded man's lips before returning to the door, rifle in hand, knowing he had fewer than 10 rounds left. In the main corridor, a Marine was thrown off his feet by the force of another blast. He hit the ground hard, ears ringing, vision doubled. Through the smoke, he saw a figure running toward one of his teammates, weapon raised. Without thinking, he reached for the only thing he had left, a combat knife strapped to his chest. He moved on instinct, rising from the floor and tackling the attacker mid-stride. The two tumbled together, crashing into a wall. The Marine drove the blade into the man's side again and again until the threat stopped moving. He stayed there, breathing heavily, the knife still clenched in his bloodied hand. Around him, the fight raged on. Gunfire echoed through the halls, but it was thinning out. The tempo had slowed, not because the enemy was stopping, but because the defenders were running out of ways to respond. On the upper floor, a Marine pulled the pin from his last grenade and held it for a long second, listening to the sounds below. He waited until he heard footsteps ascending, then tossed it down the stairwell and turned away before the blast shook the entire landing. The explosion knocked pictures off walls and sent more dust into the already choking air. He didn't cheer. He didn't react. He just reloaded his last few rounds into a spare mag and waited. In another room, a Marine with only a pistol and his knife left stood over the body of a fallen enemy. He picked up the man's rifle, checked the chamber, and used it without hesitation. It wasn't about preference anymore. It was about staying alive, keeping the line held just a few more minutes. His hands shook. His face was streaked with soot and blood, but he moved like a man beyond fatigue. They fought from room to room, trading space for seconds, every step backward a tactical necessity. The main hallway became a barricade of bodies, debris, and spent casings. The heat inside the building had risen, the stench of smoke and blood thick enough to taste. Voices from the enemy side grew louder. They were calling to each other now, barking orders, knowing their prey was faltering. One Marine, separated from the rest, found himself cornered in a side room. He checked his ammo. 2 rounds. He looked around, found a broken chair leg, and gripped it in his left hand. The footsteps came closer. The door burst open. He fired both rounds, dropped the weapon, and charged forward with the makeshift club. He didn't know if he would survive the next minute. He didn't care. He only knew that surrender wasn't an option. Back in the central stairwell, the team leader coordinated the last line of defense. His voice was calm, even as the ceiling above them shook and dust fell like snow. He marked the fallback positions with hand signals, directed fire where it was most needed, and gave his last magazine to a younger Marine who was down to a single bullet. He didn't hesitate. His own sidearm had 4 rounds left. That would have to be enough. Outside, more flares were fired. Their white glow briefly illuminated the street, revealing more movement, more fighters encircling the building. The Marines inside saw the flashes through broken windows and knew what was coming. The next push would be the final one. The noise became a blur. Gunfire, shouting, the clang of steel, the thump of boots against concrete. In one room, a Marine was engaged in hand-to-hand combat with 2 attackers, parrying a blade with a broken rifle, then using the butt of the weapon to break an arm before finishing the job with his knife. His hands were slick with blood, his breath ragged. He didn't stop moving. He couldn't. Time fragmented. Seconds stretched into eternities. Pain became background noise. The building was no longer a place but a crucible, a test of will, of instinct, of brotherhood. The team fought not for victory, but for each other. Every action was an act of survival, of defiance, of sacrifice. By the end of the hour, the air inside the structure was thick with smoke and silence. The gunfire had slowed, not because the enemy had retreated, but because few defenders remained. The Marines still standing were out of ammunition, bloodied, bruised, and armed with whatever they could find, knives, metal rods, enemy weapons, and still, they waited. Still, they stood, because there was no surrender, only the next breath, the next movement, the next second alive. The building trembled beneath the weight of the conflict. Smoke seeped through broken walls, drifting into every corner, carrying with it the scent of blood, sweat, and gunpowder. The structure moaned with every small explosion nearby, each sound blurring into the next. The walls bore impact marks and deep black burns. The stairwells had collapsed in places. Floors sagged under the strain of heat and pressure. Inside, the last surviving Marines gathered near the center of the lower level, preparing for what they believed would be their final stand. Their numbers had dwindled. The wounded were silent now, either unconscious or dead. Those who could still fight clutched blood-stained weapons with shaking hands. Many of them scavenged from fallen enemies. The ammunition was gone entirely. One Marine held a rifle with no magazine, gripped like a bat. Another carried only a knife and a shard of steel wrapped in cloth to protect his hand. They had no illusions about survival. They had done everything they could. All that remained was resistance. Then something shifted in the air. A low hum broke through the silence, unfamiliar and growing. At first, it was mistaken for another explosion building in the distance, but it held steady. Louder, rhythmic, a tremble in the walls, unlike the rest. One Marine crawled toward a shattered window and looked up into the night sky. His breath caught in his throat. The hum became a roar, rotors, unmistakable and deep. The kind of sound that meant the skies were no longer empty. A black silhouette cut across the dark sky above the street. The Apache gunship hovered, then banked, light slicing across the city block in sudden strobes. The Marines inside the building stared upward, eyes wide, disbelief washing over them like a second wind. Outside, the enemy scattered. The sudden appearance of the aircraft changed the field completely. Flares bloomed in the sky, casting erratic shadows across buildings and alleyways. The Apache circled once, then turned its cannon toward the source of the last visible muzzle flashes and opened fire. The night erupted in thunderous bursts, tracer rounds stitching across rooftops and alleyways with mechanical precision. Sparks danced off concrete as fighters dove for cover, their momentum broken by overwhelming force from above. The Marines inside remained still for a moment, listening as the chaos outside unfolded in a new direction. Radio static broke through once more, then a clipped voice, heavily distorted but unmistakable. The signal was faint, but real. Reinforcements were in range. Quick reaction force en route. ETA minutes. The words were confirmation, validation, and lifeline. With the Apache covering the perimeter, the Marines repositioned what strength they had. They moved toward the courtyard at the back of the building, the only location wide enough to support landing. The structure had partially collapsed in that direction, but there was still a path. They lifted the wounded, supported one another, and moved through corridors lit only by distant fire and failing flashlights. Outside, a second helicopter approached. Its lights remained off until the last second, then flashed once across the dark terrain before dropping low. It hovered over the courtyard, sending dust and debris flying in all directions. The thudding of the rotors echoed off the ruins, drowning out everything else. The wind from its downdraft knocked loose pieces of wall to the ground. The Marines emerged into the open slowly, carefully, unsure if they were walking into another ambush. They stayed low, dragging their injured with them, covering each angle even in their exhaustion. The helicopter crew threw down ropes and extended a side ramp as one of the gunners swept the perimeter with a mounted weapon. The door opened and two medics jumped out, weapons ready, eyes scanning. The evac team moved fast. They pulled the most critical wounded aboard first. The remaining Marines covered them, taking defensive positions behind broken stone and rusted fencing. A few fired single rounds at retreating figures in the distance, using scavenged weapons, but there was little left to fire. Still, they kept postures steady, never allowing weakness to show. One Marine collapsed while helping lift another. He had been hit earlier, concealed it, and now could no longer stand. Another Marine pulled him up, arm over shoulder, dragging both toward the ramp. Behind them, the building that had been their shelter and prison burned slowly. Flames licked out from shattered windows. Smoke curled upward, blending into the night. As the final Marines boarded, the Apache resumed a wide circle, strafing the edges of the block to discourage any last resistance. The evac helicopter rose in stages, pulling away from the courtyard with deliberate power. Inside, the medics moved fast. Gauze, injections, IV bags. Words of reassurance mixed with clipped orders. No one inside the helicopter spoke for several minutes. Each man sat with his head lowered, eyes closed or staring into nothing. Blood covered the floor. Dirt and ash streaked every uniform. Bodies leaned against one another, not out of comfort, but necessity. No one had the strength to sit alone. The city receded below them, orange and red flickers still dancing among the ruins. In the distance, sporadic gunfire echoed, but it grew softer as the aircraft moved further out. The radios now buzzed with clearer voices, confirming positions, calling in additional support, reporting contact. The battle for Fallujah was far from over. But for this group, The nightmare of that building had ended. One Marine finally looked up. His face was smeared with dried blood. A long cut traced down his jaw. His rifle lay across his knees. Empty. He didn't speak. He just stared at the floor, at the motionless boots of the man beside him. The friend who had handed him a knife when the bullets ran out. The friend who hadn't made it to the ramp. His eyes stayed there, unmoving. The medics continued working, but the cabin had grown heavy with silence again. Each survivor bore wounds too deep to see, scars that would not fade with rest or distance. The mission had changed them. What began as a routine sweep had turned into a siege, a last stand, and finally, a desperate extraction. Outside the window, the horizon was beginning to lighten. The first hints of morning pushed against the darkness, casting long streaks of gray and blue across the land. It was a new day, indifferent to what had happened beneath it. The helicopter flew forward, its rotors slicing the air, carrying what remained of the squad away from the ashes of the place they had nearly died. The base sat far from the noise of battle. Rows of concrete buildings lined the perimeter, surrounded by chain-link fences topped with rusted barbed wire. Inside the compound, the world felt distant and still, disconnected from the smoke and screams of Fallujah. The heat remained, dry and ever-present, but the air was different, thicker with the quiet of what had passed, and the weight of what had been brought back. The Marines were unloaded one by one. Stretchers moved quickly across the sand, accompanied by medics and silent escorts. Some walked off the helicopter with slow, staggered steps, each one leaving a faint mark behind. They were directed into triage tents, their uniforms stiff with dried blood, skin coated in soot and sweat. The faces of those who greeted them said enough: shock, grief, a quiet recognition that not everyone had returned, and that those who had would not be the same. Inside the medical tent, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in a pale white glow. The wounded were assessed, patched, stabilized. Painkillers dulled sharp edges, but not all wounds were physical. A Marine sat upright on a cot, his chest bandaged, eyes fixed on a single spot in front of him. His rifle had been taken during intake, but his hand still moved as though it were there. Beside him, another man lay completely still, his breathing shallow, both eyes closed. Nurses moved around them with practiced urgency. Further down the corridor, a debriefing room had been prepared. The few who could still speak were called in one at a time. A senior officer sat across from each Marine, notepad in hand, voice low. Questions were simple: what happened, where, when, how many? But the answers came out slowly. Some in fragments, some not at all. For many, the details were too fresh, too tangled in instinct and adrenaline to be unpacked. Others answered in monotone, their voices devoid of emphasis or reflection. Just facts, coordinates, names, numbers. The officer wrote everything down without judgment. Later, the survivors were given new bunks in a separate wing of the barracks. It was quieter there, away from the routine sounds of training and movement. The rooms were bare, beds stiff, walls clean. It felt wrong to be in a place untouched by fire and ash. The sheets were white. The air conditioning hummed gently. A Marine stood at the window and looked out over the open lot beyond the fence. It was empty, just sand and sky. His hand rested on the windowsill, fingers twitching slightly. His eyes didn't blink often. One of the younger Marines sat alone in the corner of the room, knees drawn to his chest. He hadn't spoken since arrival. Others came and went, checking in, sharing brief nods, sometimes sitting nearby without saying a word. There was comfort in proximity, even if no one had the strength to speak. Meals were brought, but not always eaten. Sleep came in broken stretches, interrupted by flashes of memory, by dreams that bled into waking moments. Across the hall, a duffel bag was unpacked slowly. The contents were few: personal effects, a photo folded into a pocket, a set of dog tags tied together with a rubber band, and a knife. It was the same blade that had been used when the ammo ran out. It was cleaned now, but scratches remained on the steel. The Marine who owned it placed it on the small metal desk, resting it atop a folded piece of cloth. He stared at it for a long time, unmoving. When he finally looked away, he left it there, untouched. The chaplain visited the barracks that week, offering quiet presence rather than sermons. He sat with those who would allow it, said nothing unless spoken to, and sometimes just listened to the silence. Some Marines asked about those who didn't make it. Others asked nothing at all. There were no explanations that made sense, No reasoning that could undo what had been done. Loss sat with them like a shadow in the corner of every room. Days passed slowly. Routine returned in fragments. Some began to clean their gear, piece by piece. Others walked laps around the base, keeping their bodies in motion when the mind wandered too far. Letters were written but not sent. Names were added to walls, memorials etched with care. One Marine wrote the same sentence in a notebook again and again until the pen ran dry. In the operations room, the mission log was updated. The after-action report documented every detail known, every confirmed kill, every supply drop missed, every casualty by name and time of death. It was clinical, factual, precise. But it did not capture what the Marines carried back inside them. The weight of each second spent waiting for an explosion, the sound of a friend falling beside them, the moment the last bullet was fired, the feel of a knife in place of a rifle. On the 7th day, a ceremony was held behind the barracks. It was small, quiet, with no press, no speeches. Helmets rested atop rifles driven into the dirt. Dog tags clinked softly in the breeze. A folded flag sat on a table. Each Marine stepped forward in turn, standing in silence before the markers, some with heads bowed, others staring straight ahead. There were no tears, just stillness. Later that night, one of the Marines sat outside, legs crossed in the sand, eyes turned upward to the stars. The desert sky stretched endlessly above, a black canvas peppered with light. He breathed deeply, the air cool against his skin, and listened to the silence. Not the silence of the building, not the silence of the fight, but something deeper. A silence that asked nothing, gave nothing, but stayed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. It was the knife again. He turned it in his hands, feeling the ridges along the handle, the weight of it. Then he stood, walked to the edge of the fence, and dug a small hole with his boot. He placed the knife inside and covered it with sand. No words, no ritual, just an ending. Back inside, others were settling into a sleep that would not come easy. Dreams blurred timelines, voices returned from the fire, but they were alive. They had returned, changed, reduced, hardened, but breathing. And in that, there was something they didn't yet have a name for. Not peace, not closure, just the quiet that follows survival, and the memory of everything that came before. To those who fought with nothing but courage, this is your story. Thanks for watching all the way through. If you found this story interesting, feel free to leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one.